Hi, everybody. This week I'm going to split this chapter into two different lectures, both first of all, just to give you a break at some point, and I realize you can take your breaks whenever you feel like it, but just to kind of break this up into a little bit more manageable parts, and also because there's just, once again, an awful lot of information packed in here, and I think it makes sense to kind of divide it up and think about them a little bit separately from each other. The first part of this week's readings really looks at the psychological person as opposed to the biological person that we looked at previously and focuses upon theories of cognition and emotion related to the biological person. Cognition defined as the conscious or preconscious thinking. Now, not the unconscious, those things that we can't access, but remember the preconscious is that part of our thinking that's not quite in the front of our mind but is accessible to us. So this is conscious or preconscious thinking, and it involves taking in a relevant information from the environment, synthesizing that information within our brains, and then formulating some plan of action based on that synthesis. Now, cognitions are distinguished from beliefs, which are ideas that we hold to be true. So that beliefs have a lot to do with our emotions, as we'll look at a little later on. The emotions are defined in this chapter as a feeling state that's characterized by our appraisal of a stimulus, changes in body sensations maybe that result from that appraisal, and displays of expressive gestures. So these are really different ways that emotions become apparent to us. This is distinguished from affect, which is the physiological manifestation of those feelings, whether we appear to be happy or sad or depressed or anxious. This is more in the realm of our affect. And it refers also to drives, which is our innate compulsions to gratify basic needs. These are largely unconscious, I believe, and although they're referenced here and there in the chapter, that really they're not so much dealt with in this particular unit. There are many different theories of cognitions, and these theories began to emerge in the 50s and have been around with us for a while. And they assume that conscious thinking is the basis for almost all of our behavior and emotion. Again, this is something that we're going to come back to repeatedly during this particular lecture. One theory that we're very familiar with is Piaget and his theories of cognitive operations, and his four stages of cognition. It's just kind of an interesting way of putting it. I haven't seen it displayed like this before, but that the first stage, which really is, if you think about this from childhood into adulthood, the earliest phase is activity without thought, which is something you tend to see with very little children, toddlers perhaps. And then as they age, there is some thought with less emphasis upon activity. This moves into from doing to doing knowingly, to understanding a little bit about what one is doing, and then finally to conceptualizing what one is doing. Conceptualizing thought, actually think about thinking. So the four stages of cognitive operations that Piaget identified are here, and you're very familiar with them from Psych 101 and any number of other courses that you've taken over the years. And I'm not going to go into them too deeply because of that, but just to identify that the sensory motor stage, which is the first stage, really is all about the infant and the toddler, and it's very egocentric, and again is very much focused upon motor activities and things like this, only beginning to develop a sense that objects are separate from oneself. The pre-operational stage from 2 to 7 years of age, the child is still very much focused upon himself or herself, but can begin to make use of rules or regular expectations, let's say, when new information comes in. But these rules tend to be overgeneralized, and so there's a lot of different cognitive errors and things like this in the child's thinking. Concrete operations occurs somewhere around the time when the child goes into elementary school or thereabouts. Now, the famous experiment about conservation, where the child is shown a beaker with liquid in it, and that liquid is poured into a test tube so that the level is much higher in the test tube than it is in the beaker. The child in the pre-operational stage is going to believe that there is more liquid in the test tube than in the beaker because the level is higher, whereas the quality of conservation allows the concrete operations thinker to recognize that it's the same amount of liquid that's just transferred to a different form of a holder. Now, another feature of concrete operations that is kind of important when you're working with kids is this notion that things really are very much black and white. There's there's some logic to the young child's thinking, but the child isn't able to step out of the world of rules enough to recognize those gray areas that we have in our existence. And so a lot of times you'll find young adolescents, for instance, who are moving from from concrete operations into the formal operation stage, even early formal operations. As formal operations, I've actually seen divided into two different stages by later theorists. That the early formal operations thinker still has that very black and white kind of way of thinking, and can be highly critical of people who violate rules, not understanding again that there are situations, for instance, when somebody might go faster than the speed limit, let's say, and because of some emergency, for instance, that's going on or something like that. And so anyway, the thing is significant about this for me, as somebody who's studied a lot about adolescence, is this means a lot of times those young adolescents are the ones that are the harshest critics of their parents, the ones who really tend to see their parents as hypocrites a lot, and because parents don't really always follow the rules like they tell their kids they're supposed to. Now, in formal operations, the person begins to be able to solve real and hypothetical problems using abstract concepts. So this is the stage where they talk about the person develops the ability to think about thinking, to step out of the situation and to view it kind of more or less from an external point of view and judge things based upon other points of view as well. Now, in cognitive theory, there is a concept referred to as the schema, and this is the internalized representation that we have of the world, and it really becomes very ingrained in us, and becomes sort of our pattern of thought, action, and problem solving. It's the way we see the world and the way we respond to the world, generally speaking. And schemas really change based upon two different, or rather, we deal with events around us through two different methods in order to fit into our schema or to change our schema. Assimilation, we respond to experiences based on the existing schema and really don't move out of that. And when we encounter stimuli that don't fit into the schema, we have to change that schema some, and that's called accommodation. So say the child knows the animal dog and has grown up with a puppy, and so for the little child, all animals with four legs are dogs, and a cat walks into the room and the child continues to think of the cat as a dog, assimilating this new creature into the existing schema. And the parent says, no, this is a cat. And the child then begins to work on a new schema that incorporates different information in a different classification. And that's accommodation. Now, Piaget's theory focuses upon how cognition develops. Information processing theory offers details about how these cognitive processes are organized. It's very much like a computer model, I think, of information processing, more or less. One thing that exists here is that there is a difference between the thinker and the external environment. And so this is a sensory theory that shows information flowing passively from the external world and moving into the mind and is being processed by the mind as a bit of data or something like this. Whereas Piaget's theory sees the thinker as playing a much more active role in processing that information. Now here's a sort of a diagram or a model of information processing theory, and you can see that, you know, as information gets further and further into our thought processes, some of it becomes retained, others does not, and some goes into short-term memory, some long-term memory, and is available for us later on. But not all information is retained, and some information actually is lost over time as well. Again, very much like a sort of like a computer model of processing information. Social learning theory is another approach that suggests that we're motivated by nature to experience pleasure and avoid pain, and so how we learn and how we develop cognitions is based upon this desire to experience pleasure and avoid pain. Now, remember, we spoke a few weeks ago about different models of thinking in terms of behavioral change. There's the classical conditioning, which really kind of involves the stimulus and response sort of theory, like Pavlov's dog, whereas operant conditioning goes into positive and negative reinforcement, and modeling engages the person in vicarious learning. Bandura's theory of social learning actually involves modeling. Now, these at least operant conditioning and modeling theory, I believe, involve thinking taking place between the stimulus and the response, whereas the classical conditioning seems more to be an automatic, almost an autonomic kind of response that is gradually trained into the being, the creature. Operant conditioning and modeling conditioning social learning theory implies that thinking takes place between the stimulus and the response. So in particular, like for instance in vicarious learning, we observe ourselves and we act on the basis of our judgments about ourselves and about our ability to master a situation, so that eventually we develop this sense of agency, this idea that we can take deliberate action and have an effect on our environment. Some theories of multiple intelligence exist out there. Gardner, for instance, is one theorist that we're going to touch on here in a moment. But theories of multiple intelligence suggest that we have a biopsychosocial potential to process information that can be activated in a cultural setting to solve problems or create products that are of value in a culture. In other words, I think intelligence is relative to the culture in many respects. So the brain isn't really this signal cognitive system that intakes data and spits out a response, like for instance that information processing may suggest, but it really is a central unit that has separate cognitive faculties that are moderated and managed by the brain more or less. Gardner has 8 different intelligences that we're going to talk about here, but the 2 intelligences that are ones that we're most familiar with in terms of traditional notions of intelligence involve linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence, and that is the capacity to use language and to listen and to speak, read, and write, those kinds of things. And the mathematical intelligence, of course, is the capacity for calculation, thinking logically, solving problems, reasoning, those kinds of things. There are other kinds of intelligence involve visual spatial intelligence. Now, the interesting thing about this is historically, I believe, the belief has always been that males are better at spatial intelligence than females. There are some studies that have suggested that I believe that males do a better job of rotational imagining or whatever, taking a 3D object in their mind and being able to rotate it and see it from different angles and things like this. Now, this has sort of been the basis for a sense that men are, kind of directed more towards engineering and mathematics and the scientific fields, those kinds of things. Uh, and the superiority of males in this area has certainly been challenged, and it's been showed. In fact, that I found a website one time on this, or just recently when I was looking at this, the title says "Men are better at maps until women take this course." In other words, that I think it's very possible that culturally speaking, we have and focused neglected our females in terms of training in these areas and focused upon training males in visual spatial intelligence skills. And I think the more education that we provide similarly with both genders, the degree of differences in their capacity, their intelligence in this particular area seems to diminish. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is another one. This is the ability to use their whole body to solve problems or make something or things like that. Naturalist intelligence, which is, talent in being able to relate to other creatures, other live forms in the natural environment. This includes living creatures and things like this. Musical intelligence is the capacity to think in musical images, to hear patterns and those kinds of things in our world around them. Intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence implies the ability to understand yourself and to kind of know who you are and what your capabilities are, those kinds of things, and also the ability to understand and communicate with others. And to be sensitive to differences in moods and motivations and skills and temperaments and things like this. Now, this is something that has more traditionally been seen as a female area of superiority. Women, and I think it explains in some respects, our belief at least, in that difference explains why women are often assigned the roles of raising the children and the nurturing role in relationships and things like this. And again, I think that's very debatable, but nonetheless, that's kind of how we tend to think, at least in Western culture. Now, another area in this study is moral reasoning and the development of the ability to be sensitive to and perceive what is right and wrong. That's how morality is developed here. And this develops from principles that we acquire as we grow older and as we're trained to think and interact with other people. Kohlberg had 6 different stages of moral development. Again, it's one of these things that I think we've all been exposed to more than once in our studies, reaching this stage of our education. Carol Gilligan, and not so recently anymore, but more recently than Kohlberg, has been critical of Kohlberg's theory. First of all, Kohlberg's theory, I think, was developed, as is often the case with a lot of these studies, developed using males as subjects, and so the theory really is very male-focused. And Gilligan believed that Kohlberg's theory really don't take into account nor values the differences related to genders. More on that in a moment. Here are Kohlberg's stages of moral development: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Now, as you look at these, again, you think about the child growing through into adulthood, let's say, going through the different passages and stages of life, and let's say the locus of control, is really goes from, at least theoretically and optimally, goes from external to internal gradually as the young person develops through these stages. So that in pre-conventional stages, the concern is very much about punishment, and in fact, in the very early stage, what the world says is right. Is what it says here, that if the child does something wrong, they expect punishment for sure to follow. It's almost a certainty, and those kinds of things, and then gradually, and so the child develops this sense of right and wrong, and develops proper behaviors, basically responding to the possible consequences in the outside world. As the child moves into the conventional area, he he or she begins to look for consistency in action with significant others, and seeks to conform based upon others' expectations. Social norms becomes a very important factor in the thinking of a child at this age. Wanting to be a good boy or a good girl and living up to what it is that others expect of that person. Now there is some more of an internal focus to that thought processes, but nonetheless it's still focused externally on what is expected otherwise from outside. Whereas in the post-conventional stage, the motivations really come very much from inside, and they develop this sense of this universal ethic that about what is right and what is wrong in the world, and how right and wrong should be judged based upon these universal principles and things like this. And it isn't about being punished. It isn't about suffering consequences from others. Those consequences or the rewards, the punishments and rewards, come from within, with somebody who's in post-conventional thinking. And a lot of people. It's pretty well understood, I think, that there are a lot of adults out there that never reach post-conventional thought. At best, conventional thinking is as far as many individuals go, and this again is one of the reasons why this theory, I think, is criticized, is that it's not quite as universal as Kohlberg might suggest. Now, Gilligan looked at, you can take these three stages in Gilligan's stages of moral development and really kind of overlay them on the Kohlberg's three stages, and you can see that there's a lot of similarities there, but the way she describes them and the way she looks at the stages of development are very different. Once again, in these stages, we start from the external consequences but internal motivations, and gradually the consequences or the concern becomes more about what is right and wrong, and less about what happens to the individual, but more about what the individual can do for the world. Gilligan thought that females have what she referred to as the care ethic, and also referred to interdependence as another feature of that. Whereas males are more justice oriented, they have that justice orientation, and focus more upon independent action and things like this. She believes Kohlberg's theories focus more upon that kind of thinking, whereas the interesting thing too is that Gilligan points out that the things that I think traditionally are valued in society, when you look at the kinds of things that, for instance, Western society, American society endorses, the idea of independent action, standing on your own 2 feet, taking care of yourself, competition, those kinds of things, even aggressiveness. These things are much more male focused, and the qualities that females are traditional feminine socialization involve things like nurturance and caring and being interdependent, even passivity at times and things like this are values and states of mind that are less valued by society. And Gilligan, thinks this. I think obviously this reflects the patriarchal nature of Western society and Western thought. And Gilligan's model, I think, tries to address that and to show the value of female, the more traditional female orientation to morality. So, although some mental processes are unconscious in nature, in these theories, that influence is really very minor. It is conscious thinking that's the basis for almost all behavior and emotions when you look at cognitions or theories of cognitions in our practice. Now, what is rational? The definition says that we're rational only to the extent that our schemata, our way of seeing the world, accommodates the available evidence, and our decisions aren't totally dependent on some preconceived notion of the world. In other words, so we keep an open mind about things. We're rational only to that extent. But our thinking patterns can become distorted, and sometimes we dismiss relevant information, and we develop emotional responses that really are not adapted to the circumstances. These distorted thinking patterns, cognitive distortions, what they're called, take input from the environment and lead us to psychological distress because they interpret things incorrectly or improperly. So, in a theory of cognition, and when we use this in our practice, our assumption is that changes in our thinking are going to produce changes in our emotional state. And cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, we see it referred to, really, involves that. It intervenes with the client's thought processes that produces new ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Now, it's interesting to me. Albert Ellis isn't. I don't even think he's given a mention in this text. And you're familiar with Ellis's rational emotive therapy, which is, I think, probably one of the earliest forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, and a very simple approach. Ellis became very frustrated at working in psychiatric hospitals because he felt that I mentioned this earlier somewhere, I believe, that we were really treating our clients in such a way that we were trying to make them dependent upon us, and clients would never be able to stand on their own 2 feet with the way traditional psychological or psychiatric treatment dealt with them. And so he developed rational emotive therapy as a means to equip clients with their own ability to resolve their problems, so that they step back and they look at what the situation is, what is their thoughts about that situation. In other words, what do they say to themselves about their situation? And that's where those beliefs come in that I mentioned earlier. And then what's the consequence of those beliefs? So he called it the ABCs of emotion, A being the antecedent, the activating event, B being the beliefs, the things that we say to ourselves about that event, and then C being the consequences, what it is emotionally that occurs because of those beliefs. So Ellis thinks his theory was, and the theory really behind CBT is that if we change the way we think about an event, then our emotions are going to change, and it's a way to get a grip on those kinds of things. And it makes pretty good sense, because we oftentimes can't control external. We can't control external events. We can control what goes on inside of us, according to this theory. Now, one of the things that causes us to be more upset than we have to be in the C stage are those beliefs, or those cognitive distortions that we had mentioned here a few moments ago, that really kind of disrupt the logic in our response system. So here's a list of 7 different cognitive errors. Ellis's theory had really 3 primary cognitive errors, which was awfulizing, shoulding, and can't standing. Awfulizing, making a mountain out of a molehill. Can't standing, saying, something's going to kill me, basically. I can't stand this when this happens. Of course we can stand it. The rational thought is. The irrational thought is, I can't stand it. Something should or should not happen. I should or should not have done things. Other people should react in a way that I think they don't, and they ought to, those kinds of things. This, again, implies somehow that, we are the masters of the universe, and we can dictate how other people are to act, and those kinds of things. Those are all irrational thoughts. And so what the worker does is help the client to assess those irrational thoughts, and to change them to something much more rational, so that the result will be more reasonable. Now, again, here is another list of cognitive distortions, and you can kind of see the awfulizing and the shoulding and the can't standing in there. The shoulding, I've seen that referred to a number of different times. Ellis, in fact, referred to it as masturbation, and I always thought that was kind of a funny way of remembering that. So there's different ways to behavioral change, different kinds of methods that can be used behaviorally also to change how we respond to certain situations. And here are some strategies that are really very behavioral in nature, that involve changing the way we respond to circumstances. For instance, in desensitization, for a client with a phobia, say about crossing a bridge or something like that, gradually, working with the client, taking them maybe first in their mind, considering walking across the bridge, and then actually taking that client in therapy to a park near the bridge and looking at the bridge but not thinking about crossing it, and gradually moving closer to the bridge and gradually stepping out onto the bridge little by little, and perhaps practicing certain things like relaxation techniques and different kinds of things along the way, or challenging irrational thinking, whatever approach might be working, meditation techniques, those kinds of things to reduce the anxiety level, and gradually get that client, to deal with whatever it is that is disturbing them so much. That's a good example of desensitization. And again, these are things that come from basic behavioral intervention courses that you've already had, I would imagine, at least. Now, as far as emotion is concerned, emotion is physiologically programmed according to the way we're looking at things here. Physiologically programmed into the human brain. So it is mediated by that part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and involves cognitive labeling of these programmed feelings. Some of that is a learned process, and so that does imply that there are things that can be done to unlearn some of those responses, even though emotion has this physiological programming kind of nature to it. So some emotional experience is an interpretation of an event. And this thinking also splits our emotions into two different levels: primary emotions and secondary emotions. And the primary emotions tend to have that survival quality to it, that fear and anger, the sort of the fight and flight kind of emotions, whereas secondary emotions involve learning, controlling, managing emotions to enable us to get along in groups and things like this. Sometimes they result from primary emotions, or sometimes they don't. But things like envy and guilt and shame, hope, love, those things. Davidson said that we all have different emotional styles, and there are combinations of 6 different components that are listed here. Resilience, what our outlook is, the context of, in other words, how can we modulate our emotional responses appropriate to the context, that, what's our social intuition? Are we sensitive to cues in our environment and from others? Are we self-aware? Can we focus our attention on one thing at a time when we need to? Those kinds of things. That our emotional style really depends upon our strengths and weaknesses, and that each of us are different in these 6 areas. So it's sort of a combination of all these qualities. He studied the brain a lot, did a lot of stuff to study the brain, and he came up with some very interesting things. He looked at the amygdala, I believe, in the prefrontal cortex. I think that's what it says here. In fact, I'm trying to find it in the textbook. He said that the greater the number of connections between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the better we tend to be at managing our emotions. So he was able to come across this idea from his brain imaging resource. Brain imaging research. He said that we all have different emotional styles composed of these 6 different components of emotions. So the interrelation between the cortex and the amygdala, the number of connections between them, plays a major role in determining our emotional style, and whether or not we have good control of our emotions and things like this. There's research also suggesting that there's a genetic quality to this also that's associated with our emotional styles, but that they can gradually change, and depending on the environment and life experiences and those kinds of things. I think all of this suggests, for instance, the idea of neuroplasticity. The fact that that we can, our brain can adapt to certain circumstances when it needs to. So it's just something that maybe can be useful in the long run in our practice. Now, we're looking there at the physiological theory of emotion. Now, looking at a psychological theory of emotion, psychoanalytic theory is probably the most prominent of those, and basically holds that we are essentially pleasure seekers and feelers. This again kind of goes more to the unconscious and automatic kind of responses we have to things, and less about cognitive roles, or the role of cognitions and things like that. We have internal drives, unconscious mental activity, and that those are the most important things in our behavior. We're happy when our drives are gratified. We're unhappy when they're frustrated. And while conscious thoughts are means of deciding how to gratify our drives, we also make use of defense mechanisms when we can't really manage the drives in a way that satisfy them, or when we have to encounter a circumstance that we just don't know how to deal with. Another theory of emotion, psychological theory of emotion, involves ego psychology. This has been a very big area of study in the social work field, and has really for much of the last part of the 20th century at least, and it really ties in well with the person and environment approach, because of the fact that it tends to the environment as well as the person. The ego isn't there just to reconcile our drives, that is to manage the id and the superego, but it really is also the source of our attention and concentration of our will, how we perceive things, and those kinds of things. That yes, the ego moderates internal conflicts, but it also mediates the interactions of the healthy person with the stressful environmental circumstances around us. Different from psychoanalytic theory, I think this ego psychology really emphasizes the autonomy of the ego, and so conscious thought processes get greater emphasis than they do in psychoanalytic theory. Attribution theory. This has to do with something again about how we view or how we see things that goes on around us. That it holds that our experience of emotion is based on conscious evaluations that we make about physiological sensations, in particular social settings. We respond to situations as we understand them cognitively, which then leads to a particular kind of emotion that we may experience. So here in attribution theory, the nature of the social setting is the key to the process of the emotional experience. Richard Lazarus was one person in particular that I think is particularly important in this area, and he talks about a three-part psychological theory of emotion based upon our appraisal of our situations. So the first thing we ask ourselves in any situation is whether there's a threat, and then we take immediate coping action to deal with the threat, and then we go back later on to take a closer look at things and experience a secondary emotion. Now, the interesting thing about this, I think we'll talk about this shortly, is that a lot of people, or some theorists at least in this field, believe that the more we listen to our primary emotions, that's the survival kind of thing, the smarter we are, the better our reactions are. That because of our tendency to distort our cognitions, we get things wrong when we operate on our secondary emotions. And so just something to keep in mind. Emotional intelligence is that person's ability to process information about emotions, one's own emotions as well as others, accurately and effectively. This is a fairly new area of study. And so the idea is an emotionally intelligent person is able to regulate his or her emotions optimally and respond to others in an optimal manner as well. It does require that we recognize emotions in ourselves and others and be able to regulate our own responses and to be emotionally sensitive as well, so that we can evaluate emotions in a variety of different situations and circumstances. There is some integration of intellectual and emotional abilities required with emotional intelligence as well. A person who's angry but knows that certain expressions of anger will be counterproductive, for instance, in a situation, therefore constrains his or her expressions of anger. That's an emotionally intelligent person. It wouldn't be wise for me to blow my top here, and so I'm going to just keep my cool. There are social theories of emotion as well. And a lot of this kind of grows out of the whole field of sociology. So how we perceive, again, how we interpret a situation comes before the emotion. There's a lot of, isn't there a lot of consistency, I think, in the thread is in terms of how our perception, our thought, our belief leads to a reaction, which could be the secondary emotion, based upon, an event, an activating event. And this again here implies much the same thing. These perceptions are learned, but over time will become automatic if they're repeated in those kinds of things. So the purpose of emotion in this particular theory is to be able to sustain shared interpersonal norms and to remain connected to others. So social constructionist theory is one of these theories of emotion, and it says that our emotions are socially constructed. They're transitory. That is, that they depend upon our appraisal of the situation. They can be time limited because as the situation changes, our emotions may change, our interpretation may change, and oftentimes involve a range of socially accepted actions that can be performed in any context. So emotions kind of give us a legitimized social role for us in a particular emotional state or situation. Symbolic interaction theory. Remember from Social 101, emotions develop as symbols for communication. By nature, we are, I guess, physiologically, we're more sensitive to visual than verbal cues, or at least some experts believe. And so emotional expressions are more powerful, let's say, than descriptions of emotions, because we see them visually rather than listen to them. And if we're more sensitive to visual than verbal cues, then we're going to respond more effectively. And so our emotions signal how we might act in a situation, then others can amend and adjust their own behaviors in response to that. In social work practice, Greenberg talks about emotion-focused practice theory. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, but this says that primary emotions are adaptive, and this can help us to adjust our relationship with the environment and enhance our coping. Again here, secondary emotions emerge from the primary emotions as a result of cognitive mediation. And if that mediation, if that thought process is distorted, then the secondary emotions can cause us a lot of issues, a lot of problems. George Mead believed that we appraise situations correctly with our primary emotions, but when we are frustrated in achieving emotional goals, then we get distortions in thoughts. And again, the whole notion of not acting on a primary emotion sometimes suggests that leads us to problems. The meanings that we construct about an event, about a situation, automatically determines our conscious responses. When we directly experience our primary emotions, we're functioning in an adaptive manner. If you're angry, I guess, is kind of what they're saying, here. We go back to that list of primary emotions, and those are the genuine, honest emotions. It leads me to wonder what happens if we all act on our primary emotions. I mean, I guess it might be healthier for us, but I don't know how we get along, if we get along better in a better way that way or not. I guess that's something that requires a little deeper thought. So a worker, that's perhaps using emotion-focused practice would want to activate, that should be to activate the client's primary emotional reactions, bring them to conscious awareness basically, but do so within the safety of the therapeutic relationship. And this is something that I wouldn't recommend anyone do unless they're really quite well trained in how to do this in a safe manner, because you don't want to like kind of get people's raw emotions all activated and then send them home without having brought them to some sort of resolution of it or whatever. Knowing how to do that is something that I think is very important and would require some specialized training. Finally, and then this will be the end of this particular section of the lecture, that we're going to look at cognitive emotional disorders, and this is really the psychological model, the medical model, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's now in its fifth edition, the DSM-5, is designed to provide clear descriptions of diagnostic categories so the practitioners of all disciplines can diagnose, communicate about, and treat people with mental and emotional disorders. This gives a medical handle basically on human functioning. Now, if you had an opportunity, I hope you did, to read, if you haven't read it before, or if you have a good memory of this, the article that I assigned to you in assignments about the psychiatric patients, is called "On Being Sane in Insane Places." I know it's a classic. It's I think well over 40 years old, but its point continues to be very, very valid today, and I think it could happen today just as well as any other it might have in the 1970s. And if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do that. But it points to the importance of, I guess, just what happens with psychiatric diagnoses and what that does not only to the client and the client's life and the people around that client, but also to the worker and the worker's perceptions of the client. And those are very, very important considerations. In our jobs, in our work, oftentimes we're in a spot where we have to make a diagnosis. It's just required in our work, and whether it's because insurance pays it, and insurance won't pay usually without DSM diagnoses, and or whatever it might be, the particular setting that we're working in. Not only may you have to make diagnoses, but you need to certainly have a working knowledge of what all those diagnoses are trying to say, how to do that, and yet continue to have an unbiased or an open-minded view of your client is the key to, I think, professionally approaching a client with a psychiatric diagnosis. There's a bit of tension between the person and environment model and the requirements of diagnosing that runs pretty deep. Rarely is it the case, as this slide says, that cognitive and emotional factors are the only thing behind the client's problems. There are almost always environmental factors that contribute to it as well. So it's just very important to keep in mind. You're going to have to know the DSM and learn it and understand it, but we also need to learn how to use it properly and to keep it in its place, I guess. Okay, so that's the first part of Chapter 4. And as always, if there's any questions, please do let me know. Otherwise, take a break and you can pick up with the next part of Chapter 4 later on. Thanks.